Now let's go to the former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, whose National Party was joined this week by its coalition partner in officially opposing the Voice proposal. Former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, happy Easter to you. Thank you for your time this Easter Sunday. Let me ask you first and foremost that question. Why shouldn't our First Nations people have constitutional recognition and a specific voice to Parliament?
Well, I'll give 5 reasons off the top of my head. Number one, it defines people by race. It defines people by DNA. And the first article of the United Nations Convention on Human Rights said everybody will be treated with equal dignity and equal rights. And this, of course, says that some people will be treated differently on the premise of the colour of their skin or DNA. And that philosophically creates problems for me, because it says that there's like a deficiency almost if you are of a certain race and that you're not. What's happening in Alice Springs is not determined by the colour of people's skin, it's determined by the circumstances they live in. The second point, Kieran, is this, that we have not been given all the details. The Solicitor General's advice, which is the independent legal advice to the government, has been hidden. Now, they gave it out when it was to do with the multiple ministries of the previous Prime Minister, but they haven't given it out here, and obviously that's because it doesn't suit their purpose. So it's definitely something we need to read. Then we've got the Voice, which is the actual legislation. People don't know what the legislation is, but apparently it's going to happen after the referendum. So voting for the Voice is like voting for a car which you don't know the make, you don't know the model, and you don't know the price. It's a very dangerous thing to do. The third thing, of course, is that if this becomes, inefficient, inadequate, maybe with nepotism fitting in, like we had concerns with ATSIC, we can't get rid of it. It's in the Constitution. Then you have the extensive powers in the executive, where basically in the executive, which is everything from the Governor of the Reserve Bank to the Governor-General to Cabinet, and when they go to select High Court judges, to Cabinet decisions themselves, which we have to apparently inform the Voice early, and then to the senior members of the public service. Finally, if it gets taken over or latently becomes the possession of one side of the political fence, well, it stays there. And that means for the rest of the time that we're in Australia, we've got an active cell of another political party that's unelected, that's selected, not elected, selected, and anything with that much power should be elected, not selected, in perpetuity. And there's a myriad of reasons as well. Another bureaucracy does not make people's lives better, it just creates another bureaucracy.
However, Barnaby Joyce, do you accept that what we've been doing to this point hasn't been working in closing the gap, that we've still got a life expectancy gap of close to a decade for men and women, education gaps, incarceration rates, the largest in the world for a population the size of our Indigenous Australians? Across the board, things haven't been working. Why shouldn't we try something like this?
Because you've got to prove that it works. I mean, we've had ATSIC in the past, we've had the National Aboriginal Congress in the past, we had the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee in the past, we've had commissions, community issues, we've had so many. But the thing about them is when they didn't work, we had the capacity to legislate them out and find something better. When this is there, that's it. That's it. You've got it. And if it has a form of disconnection, because what happens even in Indigenous communities, this will divide up Indigenous communities, because in my area, I've got Gomeroi, I've got Anawan, I've got Banjalung, I've got Dungari. Which one are you selecting? Because if there's 7 representatives from regional Australia, they can't all be there. And of course, you can bet your life, when you select one, the other's going to turn up and say there's a problem. I've lived in this part of the world all my life. I've lived in Werris Creek, Moree, Charleville, St George. And I live in Danglemar. This is Danglemar. There's bigger. Where I went to school was a strong Aboriginal community. This has been my whole life. It'll turn into a form of internal parochialism, because you've got different First Nations and you've got different tribes within First Nations. You've got different family groups within the different tribes. And to think that some new bureaucracy is going to solve all that, it's not. What we have to do is deal with the circumstances which people find themselves in. So if there's a problem in Alice Springs, you deal with the circumstances, whether Aboriginal, Indian, Asian or white. Otherwise you're saying, oh, well, people of a certain colour are just not capable of doing it, and therefore we have to sort of patronisingly look after a certain group. And I don't think even they would want that.
When you talk about the treating a separate group differently. Let me ask you the point that's been made by a lot of advocates for the voice, and it's the point that really underpins the whole thing, that our First Nations people were here and have been here for 65,000 years, the oldest continuous civilization on the planet. Why shouldn't they have a special recognition?
What, for the same, because all human beings are created equal. I mean, I understand, I respect that Indigenous Australians arrived here first. That's a statement of fact. But to say that any group, if I was to turn the question on its head and say poor white people are going to have a voice to Parliament and that'll be defined by their DNA and you have to prove you're white before you be part of that voice, people would be outraged, and rightly so, because it starts saying that human beings are created differently. And, you know, are we going to say that, and there are very few, but there are Aboriginal people in Mossman that they're more afflicted than, for instance, a poor white person in some of the villages that are around here? See, I've got people, Kieran, that were born in the same hospital, went to the same primary school, went to the same high school, live in the same street almost next door to each other, some cases they do, yet one's going to have a different right to the other. I mean, how on earth does that work? How do we conjure this stuff up?
Given where the polls are, do you accept that the coalition is not in line with where majority opinion on the voice is?
I think if you had polls where you actually have a strong Indigenous component, a strong, you know, Asian, Indian, white, anything else component, you probably get a different result. But I can understand in areas where people see it from a distance that there is a form of benevolence and they think this is going to work, but I'm sure you another layer of bureaucracy, if it worked, would still have the National Aboriginal Congress to be working. In ATSIC, we had problems there. There was a problem of, you know, what was happening to money. A lot of questions that were asked about ATSIC. So we had the capacity to move on and do it better. Now, the issues that are in Cunnamulla, that are in Alice Springs and Katherine, in remote communities, or even in the closer communities around here, I can't see how another layer of bureaucracy from an unelected body, remember they're not elected, they're selected, is going to have some sort of magic wand effect. And I don't understand why within that they have to be able to give advice to the Reserve Bank. I mean, that's monetary policy, that's banks, that's your interest rate, that's everybody's interest rate. I can't talk to the governor of the Reserve Bank, I can't consult with them. And once you start consulting, then of course you've got issues that could, you know, there's no good politician saying, oh, this will be able to create a veto. That's the remit of the High Court. If it's in the Constitution, they can say, well, you didn't consult properly. You left a certain item out. You weren't extensive in another one. You took too much notice of one that was irrelevant. And we all know that the High Court can overrule executive government. They did with the live cattle trade, where they just went up to Joe Ludwig and said, it doesn't matter what you said, China Plate, it's out because you haven't done the proper consultation.
So just to pick up on a few of those issues you raised, the RBA and so on, if the government were to compromise on the wording, remove reference to executive government, shouldn't the coalition be then willing to compromise? Well,
they tried. Even the Attorney General tried. He put an addendum on one of the parts of the Constitution and it was knocked out by the committee, by, you know, Marcia Langton and Ms Morris, because they're not stupid. They know exactly what they're doing. This is an incredibly powerful body and works on the premise that most people are not constitutional lawyers, so they don't quite understand the extent of what they're actually voting for. And that is why you need the Solicitor General's advice, Mr Donohue's advice. Mr Albanese has got to basically be honest and tell us what it is. And when he says, oh, we don't disclose the advice, BS. You did in the last instance, which was the multiple ministries of the previous Prime Minister. In fact, you lauded it. You made an article of faith and a promotion of yourself.
If the coalition, well, you are opposing the voice, if it succeeds, how damaging would that be for the opposition, for Peter Dutton particularly?
Well, you know, that's a sort of a hypothetical. I want the Australian people to, yes, we know we've got serious issues and we've been dealing with them forever, and I get that. This is not going to fix it. I'm going to campaign against it, because if it's successful, then Australia's all tick the box that we now believe in racial differentiation, which is something we've been trying to get out of the Constitution. The Constitution should be blind to race, to creed, to colour, to religion. It should not be part of our Constitution, it should be out of our Constitution.
Noel Pearson described Peter Dutton, and a timely reference being Easter, he described him as the Judas betraying Australia. Can you understand the disappointment of him and other leaders like him in the Indigenous community?
Well, he has a different view, and he's entitled to that. It's democracy. And in democracies, you get to vote. And if you don't like things, you vote in a different way. And unfortunately for the Voice, you don't get a vote. It's selected. Not even if you're Indigenous do you get a voice. It's selected. And, you know, I know Noel Pearson is very much connected to his side of the debate, and I respect the work he's done in his community, but on this issue, I fervently disagree.
Some Liberal moderates are going to vote in favour and campaign for a yes vote as well. Are you just as comfortable as members of the coalition doing the same thing?
Well, wouldn't it be great if people in the Labor Party had that right to basically speak their own mind? I think you'd find one of the first people who spoke his own mind, rather than have to speak the lines, would be the Attorney General, who'd say, you need some mitigants in this. I know that because he suggested them and they were knocked out.
Why wouldn't Peter Dutton allow his frontbenchers the same latitude like we saw with the coalition way back in the Republic referendum?
For the same reason, I suppose, the Labor Party won't allow it. And do you honestly believe everybody in the Labor Party has exactly the same views? Come off it. You know they don't. And in the Greens, they all vote as a bloc. At least Mr Dutton's had the decency to say, if you're in cabinet solidarity, that's how you're supposed to act. But if you're in the backbench, you have the capacity and latitude of how you vote. The Labor Party and the Greens agreed to this before they saw any details, any at all. And that gives you a sense of basically, you know, the mechanism of politics. It's belligerent, it's bloody, and it's without latitude. I mean, Mr Albanese, will you let your backbenchers, if they don't agree, to vote against the Voice?
Former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, I appreciate your time this Easter. Thanks so much.
And happy Easter, and I hope everybody's safe, and happy Easter to you too, Kieran.
Thanks, Barnaby. See you soon.